Let us go ahead and get started here. If you have your Bibles, if you want to go to Deuteronomy 5, we'll do something a little different today. Deuteronomy 5. That's where we shall begin. All right, before we get into the body of the lesson, let's see what we've got here. We have Commandment 6, which obviously beyond the midway point when you have 10 commandments, it's just, we only do one a week. It seems like it takes a while, but you do one a week, it seems like you move through it fairly quickly, which is an odd feeling, but that's where we are. All right, what do we have today? Look both ways before you cross the road. I don't know who got it, but I heard it back there somewhere. There you go. All right, let's open with prayer and we'll get started this morning. Father, thank you so much for the day and for your goodness to us. Father, I ask that you would guide in all that we do. Give us wisdom, give us discernment, Father, that we might know what you would have us to do and then have the ability to put that to practice. Accomplish your purpose in us and through us, we ask. In your name, amen. All right. Deuteronomy 5, we look at the second giving of the law here. It's exactly the same. Some of the commands, the wording is slightly different, like it might be two words. I mean, the commands are the same. With this one, in verse 17, the wording is the same. And it's pretty difficult here. You've got all of 4 words. Thou shalt not kill. Pretty simple and straightforward. And that's where we will be today. A couple things. As we work through these commands, especially the ones relating to human relationships, as I was thinking about it, it's almost as if God put together simply minimum standards. It's not as if it says, hey, you need to be nice to the guy that does. No, he simply says, here's basic minimum standards for people to get along. And when you stop and think about it, if we keep these, pretty much all those others are unnecessary. Some people would simply refer to these as rules of common decency. Now, I'm not sure common decency is all that common anymore. Kind of like common sense, right? And you walk around and say, oh my. People are, some are unintentionally rude because they don't know better or they're not thinking, they're absorbed in whatever. Some are intentionally rude. They don't care what you think or what you're doing or who you are. They have something to do, and you're in the way. And so these are minimum standards. Common decency. And these guidelines, thou shalt not kill, honor your parents, these apply to anyone, anywhere and everywhere. And that's significant because we'll see as we get into the first point here. These are 10 commandments from God to the children of Israel. God preserved them in his word for a reason. And we're part of the reason. Specifically, this command, thou shalt not kill, is a reminder that life is sacred and should be treated as such. As we're reading in the word, there's some things that we need to be aware of. And we know this, and there's not a whole lot that's going to be shockingly new revelation here, okay? But we need to be familiar with English as it's used today. Now, that's difficult for the former English teacher because English is slaughtered from one end of the world to the other today, okay? But we need to understand the language. And I say that because I'm assuming that most of you are reading an English Bible, all right? If we were in another nation, we would substitute the first word in this line, okay? We need to be familiar with English as it was used at the time of translation. The translators that gave us this text that we're reading, we need to understand what they meant. Because there are some words that were used then that aren't used now. Concupiscence comes to mind immediately. There are other words that were used then that are used differently than they're used now. And you can come up with some really fun false doctrine if you don't know what was intended. But we also need to be familiar with the original language. And I say original because are we looking at Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek? So we'll just use original, including their vocabulary. The connotations of the vocabulary, that's the kind of the implied meaning. And then the nuances of that vocabulary. Because in God's word, it's kind of interesting. He uses figurative language at times, like a lot of times. And we need to be able to know, okay, what does he mean by this? Because if a picture's worth 1,000 words, a well-written word is worth multiple words. We don't have a picture Bible, but we've got a Bible that's well-written. And it's written to convey a meaning. And that is important. Now, all of that, we look then at this command, thou shalt not kill. Vocabulary is important. There's not a whole lot of connotation or nuance included in this one. Vocabulary is important, and we'll see that before we get too deep into this. As we read the Bible, I need to know, you need to know what God means, not what I think or you think. And that's a difficult one for people. Because people, I'm always right. Just ask, I'll tell you. Right? And so, just think on any given topic, how many different messages can we hear with a different slant? And so we ask, who's right? Who's right is easy. God. And so I need to be willing to do to set my wishes, wants, beliefs aside to find out what does God mean when he says this. Because it's not our place to take God's place. It's so interesting as you read through the prophets, thus saith the word of the Lord. Or the word which God gave to such and such a prophet. They make it very clear that they are simply communicating what God has told them to say. And I'm afraid there are a lot of people, preachers and others, that are simply communicating what they felt they needed to say. And those two ideas are vastly different. I need to know what does God want and what does God mean, and I need to be willing to keep him in his place. So let's look at this command. I have the Exodus passage there. In case you're curious about what it says, thou shalt not kill. Exodus 20:13. Thou, who's it written to? And I don't necessarily make this the big deal every week, but it's from God to the Israelites through Moses. God, speaking to Moses, communicates, here's the message for those people down at the bottom of the mountain. But it applies to us today. And basically what it says is man does not have the right to take the life of another without cause. And cause is not simply that you offended me. Okay. Which is a whole nother topic in today's world, is it not? So the thou is, like we saw in the introduction, it's anybody, anywhere and everywhere. Thou shalt not. That's a fairly strong prohibition. Okay? There's no question about it. Don't do this. There's no wiggle room in here. It's not, well, but you don't understand what he did. But this command demands that we know what this command means. Because as we read through the Bible, we find God telling the Israelites, either as a whole or as individual, you need to exterminate this individual. As I'm just standing here off the top of my head, Saul and Agag. Saul was supposed to help Agag assume room temperature and didn't do it and was punished for it. Well, wait a minute. There says, thou shalt not kill. So we need to know what the command means. Otherwise, we've got a huge problem with God himself. So what does it mean? Thou shalt not kill. First of all, God alone gives life. We must understand that. And as such, God alone has the right to take life. Man likes to substitute himself for God. But we need to understand that it is God's role to give and to take life. There are times, however, that he delegates that responsibility. Two ideas that I have there: war and capital punishment. God tells the children of Israel to go to war. Well, when you go to war, what is a natural byproduct? A term that you will not hear in church very often, and I don't know that I've ever given this name in a church setting. Rush Limbaugh used to say that the Army has two jobs: kill people and break things. Generally speaking, that's true. So when you go to war, what happens? People are killed and things are broken. Well, wait a minute. Thou shalt not kill and war, those are diametrically opposed. Or are they? And I'm glad you asked. We'll come to that. Because there are multiple Hebrew words for killing. And the word that's used here is used to specify murder. Which, going back to the internet, we need to know what God means. Going back to earlier here in this point, we need to know what the command says. The implication of this then is killing with premeditation and intent. So thou shalt not kill. What does it mean? It means we should not, in our world, first-degree murder is what the term that comes to mind, is it not? Premeditation and intent. Well, how does all of this apply to us here in 2025? That's really where we'll spend the most of our time. The command itself is, I want to say short and sweet, how you talk about murder being sweet, but the command is short and succinct. Okay? Thou shalt not kill. Well, what is the application of that command in our world today? Well, the verb here that's used includes both intentional and accidental killing. However, it's never used in the Old Testament to describe killing and war. Remember when we were talking in the introduction, we need to understand vocabulary and connotation and nuance, and I mentioned there's not a whole lot of nuance or connotation with this one. So what's the vocabulary? You've got multiple words. Which word did God choose? Because God chose that word on purpose. And this word can be used intentional or accidental, but it's never used to describe the killing of war in the Old Testament, or killing in war in the Old Testament. No, we already mentioned, these are like minimum standards for a just society. Don't go and kill. And something that came to mind for me, we hear the term limited government. God set in place a very limited, our Constitution is not long. Some state constitutions are 3, 4, 8, 10 times longer than the federal Constitution. Our national Constitution, with standard print and standard size paper, is only like 4.5, 5 pages. There are some state constitutions that are 300 pages long. We have a simple framework in place. And that's what God does with these 10 commandments. Here is a framework to guide human relationships. And the goal was so that people can dwell together in peace. Now, Adam and Eve had perfect peace in the Garden of Eden, and they shattered that fairly quickly. God gives us this framework so that men can dwell together in peace, and we do a good job of shattering that fairly quickly. As we look into the gospel, or into the Word of God, specifically in the gospel and the epistles, we see some of the motivating factors behind these things. In this case, murder, discussed and addressed. And we'll see some of that as we continue through this. Interestingly enough, this may be the one command that is still universally accepted. We'll just jump down the road a command or two. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Is that universally accepted in our world today? Oh, heavens no. But murder is. This command is still pretty much accepted. For the most part, as you go through history, practically every civilization throughout history has had some kind of law or ordinance against murder. And the best way to deal with this is that we ought to show respect and restraint to those who offend us. It doesn't mean that I need to accept and agree with them. Well, why would I respect them? We'll get to that too. Why would I show restraint? So that I'm not guilty of violating the command of God. We mentioned already, the Hebrew language has multiple words for killing. Some sources say 8, some say 7. There are multiple words. The word that's chosen here is chosen on purpose. I mean, think about that for a second. If there are multiple words that could be used for the act of killing somebody, why, as God is speaking, did he speak the word that we have? Remember the first set of tables, he wrote them. Why did he write this word? Moses shattered that one. So God reiterated, he repeated, he said it again. Moses wrote. If he had written the wrong word, God could have very easily have corrected him. Why did the children of Israel get this word for killing? Because this one very clearly forbids the unjust taking of a legally innocent life. Unjust and legally innocent, two important terms there. Now, it doesn't mean that that person is perfect and has done nothing wrong. But in this particular instance, so the vocabulary is important. Go, if you would, to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5. We'll look at a couple other passages. One of them right now, one of them in another point or two. Matthew 5. And this is not the only one that we could go to. Matthew 5 and verse 21. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill. I don't care if it's standing before you right now, sitting on my couch as I was putting this together, or years ago as this always makes me chuckle when I see how Christ says this. Ye have heard that it was said of them of old. This is one of the 10 Commandments. He's speaking to the Jews and the Pharisees. Of course they've heard this. You've heard that it was said by them of old time. They were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. I mean, this was their Mount Rushmore. And Moses wrote this down. This is not just by them of old. This is spoken by God to the leader of the nation and preserved for all of them for all times. So every time I read this, it kind of makes me, in my mind, chuckle a little bit. As Christ is, you've heard that it was said by them of old time. Yeah, this is like every day they hear this. Thou shalt not kill. And whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. You don't kill, and if you do, you're in trouble. And when he's talking about the judgment, he's talking about eternal judgment here. But I say unto you, remember we saw earlier the line that said you get into the Gospels and the epistles, they start to build on some of this, start to address motives as well. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council, but whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. He continues on there. Just think for a second here. There's not a whole lot of murder that doesn't originate with somebody being angry. So if we can take care of the anger part, we may solve a lot of problems. May. Well, the Old Testament command is expanded in the New Testament era. As God says, it's not just don't kill, don't be angry. And notice it does include that statement there, without a cause. That's important to understand. As God includes the motive as well as the act in this. And in this passage, anger is equated to murder. Because anger is like the root cause. That idea without a cause is important, and we'll come back and see that in just a second. Go to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians 4. Go from the Gospels to the epistles. If I can find Ephesians. In just 2 verses here. Verse 26, be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, neither give place to the devil. Be angry and sin not. So Paul is saying, okay, there is an anger, and there's an anger that's sinful. Don't get into that sinful anger. Be angry and sin not. And it's important to understand that. You can be, what do we call it, righteous anger. But we have to be very careful because we're not good at keeping that anger in its lane. And next thing you know, we're thinking and doing things that we ought not. So the Gospels, the epistles take and build, and they start looking at motives. Going back to that, without a cause. God differentiated between murder and manslaughter. Remember we talked about the intentional or accidental? God differentiates between those. I think Pastor the other night mentioned something about the cities of refuge. You look into the law, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, when they talk about the cities of refuge. The whole idea was, if you are responsible for the death of somebody and it was truly accidental, as long as you stay here, you're okay. God had a recourse in place so that you could or would not be punished for murder if you didn't murder. Murder was what? Intentional and premeditated. If it was an accidental, you're working and the equipment slips and somebody gets killed, oh, sorry, you killed him, you die. But it was an accident. If it's legitimately an accident and there was a process in place to judge that, if it was legitimately an accident, there was a way that you could live without being killed, as long as you did what you were supposed to. God differentiates. Well, why would God differentiate if all killing violates the command? I mean, so the fact that he did make that differentiation is important for us to know. So the question then that we have here is, okay, well then what killing is covered by this command? Well, first of all, homicide. The intentional, I should have included the word intentional, the intentional killing of another. Now, that's more of a legal definition because in a general sense, all death is homicide. Because Homo sapiens are people, and if they died, it's just all, but the legal term here is referencing the intentional killing of another. So homicide is included. Why? Because who gives life? Who has the right to take life? Well, we need to know that. We need to understand that. Oh, here's a question mark. How about suicide? The killing of self. Well, who gives life? Who has the right to take life? Oh. Next, euthanasia. The killing for humane purposes. Now, this is just an aside, has nothing whatsoever to do with this lesson. When I was but a youngster, a wee lad, a long time ago in a land far, far away, known as Upper Michigan, whenever we would hear this term, I was always, what do the youth in Asia have to do with it? I don't understand. What are we talking about? It was a while before I figured out this is one word, euthanasia. Well, what is it? Now, this will go back before the days of our young people, but most of you remember the name Jack Kevorkian. Again, that was a few years ago now. While Kevorkian's name is not going to appear in the news, the idea of mercy killing does still come up once in a while. Killing for humane purposes. You say, yeah, but we want to help them to get out of their pain and suffering. Who gives life? Who has the right to take life? Now, we can go into the Psalms and we can find David with his imprecatory prayers where he would say, God, would you help them to die quicker? But David, when he had opportunity, didn't take advantage of helping someone to die quicker. Did he not have every cause? We talked about without a cause. Did he not have every cause to kill Saul? And yet he did not because spiritually, biblically, he had not cause to kill Saul. He said, Saul is God's anointed, and God will address it. God will deal with it. So homicide, suicide, euthanasia, abortion. The killing of the unborn. Or as a lot of Christian counselors and stuff in this realm would talk about, not unborn, but preborn. Is that an issue? Oh, yeah. As the federal statutes regarding abortion were changed, think back just a year and a half ago to the uproar. Why? Because we don't view life as being sacred. God alone gives life, and God alone has the right to take life. Now, there are times where God delegates that. And as we move into the exciting conclusion, we'll see some of that. Now, we today live in an uncivilized, civilized society. Is it not? Looking for eggshells. I am somewhat of a traditionalist. Okay. This is not saying that if you do, you're wrong. Okay, so don't misunderstand me. This is just saying me as I'm standing here. I'm not a huge fan of tattoos. Doesn't mean that I can't state biblically that they're right or wrong. And there are people who will make a claim. I can't make that claim. I'm not a huge fan of piercings. Now, keep in mind where I work. Okay, I work in a warehouse job. The qualifications are that you can breathe and walk. And not walk well. We have to go through metal detectors to get in and out. There are people, I still try to figure out how they get in the metal detector, let alone anything else that they have with them. I don't understand. I know they don't fly. There's no way they could get on the plane. And not to make fun of, that's the world we live in. It's a good thing there are warehouse jobs because I'm not sure that they could get a job anywhere else. And that's the society we live in. And again, how you fall on that is completely up to you. That's between you and God, and I am not God. I have my view, but that's mine. But take that then to the next level, not the piercings and the tattoos, but the civilized and uncivilized. We've already talked about rudeness and unintentional rudeness versus intentional rudeness. And people are intentionally rude, and they don't care. And they will be harmful to you while being rude if that means that they can get what they want sooner. I was talking to Jeff right before we started. My world is about to get busy. We are just a tick away from Black Friday. 1 month away, 5 weeks. However, as I was cruising through the TV last night, going from football to baseball, Cubs lost, boo. As I was cruising through I won't mention Hallmark and Great American Family by name, but Christmas movies have already started. Okay? Why does Amazon and Walmart have Walmart deal days and Amazon Prime Day in October? To beat Black Friday sales. And so my world's about to get turned upside down, and sales are already starting. Sit back and watch human behavior as the big sales start to hit. I want that, you have that. Hey, look at that. Pow, now I have that. We live in an uncivilized, civilized society. With that in mind, we speak of the sanctity of life, but society treats life as anything but. We treat people as if they were disposable. And that's a sad place to find ourselves. The next couple points go back to the whole Hebrew has multiple words, but it's intentional. And in these next 3 instances, they're quotes that I came across. Hebrew possesses multiple words for killing. If any one of these could signify murder, premeditation and intentional, this is the verb. This one was chosen on purpose. It's murder. All right, keep that in mind. Only 2 words are used in Hebrew as blunt as the order no killing would be in English. So in Hebrew, there are only 2 words that would be this blunt. Thou shalt not kill. And shockingly, God chose one of these 2. So when he says thou shalt not kill, this is just, again, simple and straightforward. Here's the command. But then this long one here. This important distinction explains how someone can quite consistently, important term, consistently argue for the principle of capital punishment and the prohibition of murder. When carried out properly, capital punishment is a killing with legal justification. And that is an issue in our Christian world today. You have Christians that would support abortion. We scratch our head and say, how? Those same people would be anti-capital punishment, and we scratch our head and say, how can you argue both sides? And yet, if we are going to be biblical, how does that fit in? God delegates the right to take life to some people in some places at some times. And the idea here is war and that with legal justification. Which when we go back and look at murder versus manslaughter, cities of refuge, the council decides. And God says, if it was a murder, the city of refuge isn't going to save you. If it was manslaughter, the city of refuge will save you. God had a way to determine what was the crime and what is the actual legal, justified punishment for said crime. And that's important for us to understand. When God says, thou shalt not kill, I can't. Government may be able to. Well, what we're faced with then, if I don't like the government, then they don't have that right. If I like the government, then they have that right. And it comes back, it's not my place to decide that. Next thing we have here is the prohibition of murder against murder is directed toward humans. The killing of animals is not included in the meaning of the command. And the sub-point here, man is made in the image of God. Critters are not. You may love your puppy. Puppy's not going to heaven. And so when God says, thou shalt not kill, how can you justify that and still eat beef? That's easy, with a fork and a knife. Seriously, you will have people that will ask such a question. There are people who will eat a vegan or vegetarian diet for health purposes. Okay, I can respect that. There are people who will do so based upon what they will call moral purposes. Good, more steak for me. Seriously, that's what it amounts to. There is not a biblical mandate that says you can't eat meat. In fact, when we look at some of the offerings in the Old Testament. You take the best part, you offer it, and then you take it off there and you cut it up and feed it to the priests. Now, why would God say that if we weren't supposed to eat that? And there are other passages that will talk about the eating of meat. And so, when we're talking about thou shalt not kill, the difference between murder and manslaughter, difference between murder and capital punishment, difference between murder and war, difference between murder of man and the killing of an animal. We need to know the language, the vocabulary, the connotations, the nuances. Not a whole lot of connotation and nuance in this, but the vocabulary is very important. And the last point that I have here, we may get done a couple minutes early. Last point that I have here, in a world that is becoming increasingly violent, we must show the love of God. Increasingly violent. Oh, my word. I mentioned before, this is, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago maybe, I don't remember. Who knows, maybe it was months ago at this point. When we were growing up, if you were growing up in the country, it was not uncommon back in the day for the kid to go to school with the gun in his car, knowing that he was going hunting on the way home. At work, again, I work for Fortune 100 company, okay, so kind of big, fairly strict. If you have a gun in your car in the parking lot, you will get fired. Not in the building, in the parking lot. If it's on their property and they find out about it, you have lost your job. And it's their property. It's their game. They can make the rule. I'm fine with that. I know what the rules are. Not a problem. But what would be the thought in your mind if you were driving around and saw a gun in the back of somebody's car today in 2025? A little different than when you were a kid or a teenager. Well, why is that? Let's listen to the news for a week. We'll find valid reason to think about that. And I am one who is pro-Second Amendment. Again, keep in mind, Dad was the game warden, okay? Yeah, he put on a uniform and a gun when he went to work every day. Unless he was going to court, in which case he put on the uniform and put on the gun later. I think, maybe he wore it to work. They'll watch this and he'll tell me next week whether he wore the gun to the court or not. But seriously, I used to joke, he had an arsenal in the house bigger than some third world countries. I grew up in Upper Michigan. That was a way of life. Today, 2025, you'd have people calling the cops. Why? Because they saw what happened on the news last week and they're scared. We live in a world that is increasingly violent. Goes back to that whole rudeness idea. You have a disagreement. How do you settle it? To sit down and speak cordially? That's what the whole killing of Charlie Kirk, that fits into the topic with murder. The amazing thing to pull out of that in relation to what we're talking about here, you know what even a lot of his opponents would say? He was willing to sit and talk and have discourse. Why? Because that's not something we do anymore. We don't sit and talk, we argue. When you're arguing, your mouth is open and your ears are closed. You're not listening. And when we argue, emotions start to ramp up, including anger. And we saw anger already talked about. We live in a world that is increasingly violent because man has no self-control. And the end result is, you have offended me, I will kill you. And that's where we find ourselves here in Deuteronomy 5 or Exodus 20. God says, thou shalt not kill. Who is the thou? Joe Q. Public. I do not have that right. I can't believe the government would execute. Government may have that right if all of the legal steps have been exhausted. I can't believe we're going to... The justification for the war is one thing. The act of the war is different, and the act of the war says that killing is a necessary component. Thou shalt not kill. Short little command. Powerful command. A command that it's important for us to know, what does God say? How do we apply that in our lives today? And so, I mentioned earlier, as we go through these next couple, we may have one a week or may have two, depending upon how all the notes come together. But there's just a lot here as God sets this framework for man to dwell together in peace. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be nice to just watch the news and rather than, I can't believe they did this again. And you watch the news or something else and I go to work. How are things going? Blood pressure's up. We live in a world that everybody's blood pressure's up. Why? It's just unsettled. It's an uncivilized, civilized world. But we have the love of God. We need to show that to the people around us. Father, would you guide in all that we do? Give us wisdom. Father, know us how to act and react to the people around us. Know us how to engage in cordial discourse with people with whom we have disagreement. Father, help us to rightly exhibit the love of God to friend and foe. Accomplish your purpose in all that we say and do, I ask. You with the service to come. Father, help us to listen. Help us to be engaged in singing and worship. And as your word is preached, God, help us to look for principles that we can apply in our lives. And we ask this in your name, amen. Have a great day.